You ever stop a man from boarding a ship he once saved? The question came quietly, carried on the salt wind rolling across Pier 14 at Naval Station Norfolk. Lieutenant Ethan Parker didn't answer it at first. In fact, he wasn't even sure the old man had meant it as a question. The lieutenant stood at the base of the gangway of the USS Resolute, arms folded neatly behind his back in the precise posture drilled into him at the academy, his crisp Navy uniform pressed so sharply it caught the morning sunlight like polished steel. Behind him, the destroyer rose from the harbor water in a wall of gray metal and antennae, a modern warship humming softly with generators and electronics. The scent of diesel fuel mixed with the sharp tang of Atlantic air, and gulls circled overhead, crying as if arguing with the wind itself. Visitors were beginning to gather along the pier for the scheduled ceremonial tour, families and retired sailors moving slowly along the designated ropes, snapping photos and pointing at the towering radar arrays above the deck. But the man standing in front of Lieutenant Parker did not look like a tourist. He was old, easily in his 80s, tall once, but now slightly stooped with the quiet weight of years. His hair was thin and silver, stirred by the breeze, and he wore a faded navy blue jacket that looked like it had crossed more oceans than most sailors ever would. The jacket hung loose on his shoulders, but it was clean, carefully kept, like a uniform long after the war had ended. On the left sleeve, barely visible beneath the wear of decades, was a patch so weathered the colors had almost dissolved into the fabric. Lieutenant Parker noticed it only briefly before dismissing it, as some relic bought in a souvenir shop years ago. "Sir," Parker said firmly, stepping half a pace forward to block the gangway ladder. "This area is restricted. Visitors stay behind the ropes. If you're here for the tour, it starts down the pier." The old man didn't argue. He didn't even look at Parker right away. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the USS Resolute, studying the hull, the deck lines, the radar mast rising into the sky like a skeletal tower. There was something strange in that gaze, something deeper than curiosity, almost like recognition. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low and gravelly but steady. "She's bigger now," he said quietly. Parker frowned. "Excuse me." The old man lifted one hand slowly, pointing toward the ship's forward deck. The radar tower used to sit lower. A couple of sailors standing nearby exchanged amused looks. One of them chuckled under his breath. Lieutenant Parker's patience tightened. He had a schedule to keep, and the captain had made it very clear that the boarding list was restricted to invited guests and personnel families. The last thing he needed was a confused retiree wandering onto the deck. "Sir," Parker repeated, his tone sharper now, "you can't board this ship." The old man finally turned his head and looked directly at him. Up close, the lieutenant noticed the lines on the man's face weren't just from age. They were the kind carved by decades of sun, salt, and hard wind. The kind you saw on old fishermen and men who had spent too much of their lives at sea. The old man nodded slowly, as if he had expected the answer. "I figured you might say that," he replied. Then he looked past Parker again, up toward the bridge of the destroyer, and added softly, almost to himself, "Funny thing is, I remember when she almost didn't make it back at all." Lieutenant Ethan Parker held his position at the foot of the gangway, the steel steps rising behind him toward the deck of the USS Resolute, while the old man continued to study the ship with a calm patience that seemed completely unaffected by the tension building on the pier. The morning sun had climbed higher over the Atlantic now, turning the gray hull of the destroyer into a sheet of bright reflected light that shimmered across the water. Sailors moved along the deck above, checking lines and preparing for the visiting group that would arrive within the hour, their boots tapping lightly against metal as the ship hummed with quiet mechanical life. A warm breeze rolled through the harbor carrying the smell of salt water and distant fuel, and it fluttered the edge of the veteran's old jacket just enough to reveal the worn patch again. Parker noticed it this time more clearly, though only for a moment. The stitching was frayed, the colors nearly faded away, but the shape of it was still there, a circular emblem, with an anchor at its center and a faint outline of stars that had once been bright. Still, to the young officer it looked like nothing more than a decoration from another era, something sentimental but irrelevant to the rules of the present moment. "Sir, I need you to step back behind the rope line," Parker said, his voice firm but controlled, projecting the calm authority he had practiced for years. A few visitors had begun to slow their pace nearby, sensing that something unusual was happening at the gangway. Cameras lowered slightly, and quiet whispers drifted through the small crowd. The old man finally shifted his gaze away from the towering destroyer and looked at the lieutenant again. His eyes were steady, thoughtful, as though he were measuring something far beyond the immediate conversation. "You have got good sailors on board," the veteran said quietly. Parker blinked once, caught off guard by the comment. "I beg your pardon." The old man nodded toward the deck, where two young sailors were adjusting a line near the bow. "The way they move," he continued. "Quick, but careful. That is how you know they respect the ship." One of the nearby sailors on the pier let out a soft laugh under his breath, shaking his head at what he assumed was rambling nostalgia. Parker did not laugh. Instead, he straightened slightly, his expression tightening. "Sir, this is not a public access moment," he said. "If you served in the Navy, we appreciate that. But access to the ship requires authorization." The veteran listened without interrupting. Then he glanced once more toward the Resolute, his eyes tracing the line of the hull from bow to stern as if reading a familiar story written in steel. "Authorization," he repeated quietly, almost thoughtfully. "That is fair." For a few seconds neither man spoke. The gulls overhead cried against the wind, and the water slapped softly against the concrete pilings beneath the pier. The old man rested one hand on the weathered railing beside the gangway, his fingers brushing the cold metal with a strange familiarity, like someone greeting an old friend after a long absence. Parker noticed the gesture and stepped forward quickly. "Sir, please do not touch the access rail," he said. "You need to step away from the boarding point." The old man complied immediately, lifting his hand and taking one slow step back, though the faintest hint of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Relax, Lieutenant," he said gently. "I am not trying to cause trouble." Parker exhaled through his nose, maintaining his stance. "Then I suggest you move along," he replied. The veteran nodded again, accepting the instruction without argument. Yet instead of leaving, he looked up at the ship one more time and said in the same quiet voice, "She used to answer to a different name when I first stepped aboard." Parker frowned slightly, unsure whether the man was confused or simply reminiscing. Behind them, the low murmur of the growing crowd continued, and none of them realized that a young petty officer standing 20 yards away had just begun staring at the old patch on the veteran's sleeve with a look of sudden, uneasy recognition. Petty Officer Daniel Cruz had been organizing a stack of visitor safety pamphlets near the edge of the pier when the movement of the old jacket caught his eye again. At first he had not paid much attention. Retired sailors came through Norfolk all the time, men who wanted one more look at the ships they had once served on. Most wore old hats or jackets with patches stitched onto them, like souvenirs from a different lifetime. But something about this one felt different. Cruz narrowed his eyes slightly and looked again toward the gangway where Lieutenant Parker still stood blocking the old man from boarding. The wind shifted just enough to pull the fabric of the veteran's sleeve tight across his arm. For a brief second the faded patch faced the sunlight directly, and the shape of the emblem became clearer. Cruz felt a small, uneasy twist in his stomach. He had seen that design before. Not often, and not in person, but somewhere else. Somewhere important. He took a slow step forward without realizing he had moved. The anchor in the center of the patch was not decorative. It had a particular curve to it, an old style used decades ago. Around it were faint outlines that looked like 5 stars arranged in a circle, almost invisible now after years of wear. Cruz tried to place the memory. It hovered just beyond reach, like a word sitting on the tip of his tongue. Around him, the morning activity continued normally. A family walked past the rope line with a young boy pointing excitedly at the ship's radar, massed nearly 100 feet above the deck. 2 sailors wheeled a cart of bottled water across the pier. The destroyer's loudspeaker crackled briefly as someone tested the communication system. But Cruz barely noticed any of it. His focus remained locked on that patch. He had seen it in a photograph once. No, not a photograph. A display. His mind suddenly jumped backward several years to his first visit to the Naval Academy Museum during training. There had been a hallway dedicated to ships that survived near disaster during the Cold War years. Each display showed a photograph, a short description, and sometimes an old patch from the crew that had served aboard the vessel. Cruz felt his pulse tick upward slightly as the memory sharpened. One of those displays had featured a damage control team credited with saving an entire destroyer after a catastrophic engine room failure at sea. The patch had looked exactly like this one. Cruz looked back toward the old man again, studying him more carefully now. The veteran stood quietly a few feet from the gangway with his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze drifting up toward the bridge windows of the Resolute, as though he were searching for something familiar. Lieutenant Parker remained in front of the ladder, posture rigid, clearly determined not to allow the man any closer to the ship. Cruz felt the uneasy feeling grow stronger. It was possible he was mistaken. After all, patches changed slightly over the years, and old sailors sometimes stitched replicas onto their jackets for sentimental reasons. But the more he looked at it, the more certain he became that this one was real. The thought made him swallow slowly. If that patch meant what he thought it meant, then the quiet old man standing 20 feet away from him was not just a nostalgic visitor hoping for a tour. Cruz turned slightly and looked up at the destroyer again, his eyes moving across the hull number painted in bold white letters. Then he looked back at the veteran and felt a strange realization settle into his mind. The ship's name might have changed over the decades. The radar tower might have grown taller. The electronics might have been replaced a dozen times. But the bones of the vessel were still the same steel hull that had been launched nearly half a century earlier. And if Cruz was remembering correctly, the man who wore that patch had been on board the night the ship almost never came home. Petty Officer Daniel Cruz felt the weight of the realization settle in his chest like a slow tide rising. He glanced again at the faded patch on the old man's sleeve, then back at the massive gray destroyer towering beside the pier. The harbor wind carried the low hum of the ship's generators across the water, a steady mechanical heartbeat that echoed through the steel hull. Cruz had heard that sound every day since being stationed in Norfolk, but suddenly it felt different, almost heavier with meaning. The museum display from years ago came back to him in sharper detail now. There had been a photograph of a young crew standing beside a battered destroyer returning to port after a long night at sea. The caption beneath it had described a moment when the ship had nearly been lost to a catastrophic systems failure during a storm in the North Atlantic. The vessel had drifted powerless for hours while engineers fought to stabilize it. According to the plaque, one enlisted sailor had crawled through flooded compartments and restored critical systems just in time for the crew to regain control. The museum guide had said that the sailor's calm actions saved the entire ship and everyone aboard. Cruz remembered staring at the small cloth patch displayed beside the photograph. It was almost identical to the one now hanging loosely from the sleeve of the quiet old man standing only a few yards away. Cruz's pulse quickened. He looked back toward Lieutenant Parker at the base of the gangway. The young officer still stood firm, posture rigid and professional, clearly convinced he was dealing with nothing more than a stubborn visitor who did not want to follow the rules. Parker's voice carried faintly across the pier as he repeated instructions about staying behind the rope line. The old veteran did not argue. He simply listened, nodding once or twice while keeping his attention on the ship itself. Cruz studied the man more closely now. The veteran's posture was relaxed, almost patient, like someone who had spent a lifetime wading through storms that lasted far longer than this conversation. His eyes moved slowly across the deck, pausing at certain details that most civilians would never notice. The placement of the radar dome, the angle of the forward gun mount, the small ladder near the bow used by deck crews during maintenance. Each glance felt deliberate, as if the old man were quietly confirming that familiar pieces of the past were still there beneath the modern upgrades. Cruz felt the strange certainty growing stronger. If his memory was correct, the sailor connected to that museum display had been part of the very crew that kept this ship alive during its most dangerous night. The patch had been created afterward as an unofficial symbol among the crew who survived the incident. It had never been widely issued, which explained why most sailors would not recognize it. Cruz realized his hands had stopped moving. The pamphlets he had been organizing remained untouched on the table beside him. For a long moment, he simply watched the quiet exchange at the gangway. The lieutenant was following procedure exactly as he had been trained to do. None of this was technically wrong. Yet Cruz could not shake the growing feeling that something deeply important was unfolding in front of them, and almost no one realized it. A small group of visitors had now gathered a short distance away, curious about the delay at the gangway. Their quiet murmurs drifted across the pier. Above them, the American flag on the stern of the destroyer snapped sharply in the wind, its bright colors standing out against the pale blue sky. Cruz took a slow breath and made a decision. If the memory from the Academy Museum was correct, then someone higher in command needed to know immediately who might be standing on this pier. He pulled a small communication device from his pocket and stepped several yards away from the growing crowd, keeping his voice low as he contacted the ship's operations office. His eyes never left the old man as he spoke. And somewhere deep inside the command structure of the ship, a name that had not been spoken in many years was about to reach the ears of someone who would recognize it instantly. Petty Officer Daniel Cruz kept his voice low as the call connected, turning his shoulders slightly so the small group of visitors could not hear what he was saying. The harbor wind pressed his uniform against his back and carried the distant sound of rigging tapping against metal somewhere along the pier. Operations, this is Petty Officer Cruz on Pier 14, he said quietly. I need you to run a quick verification on a possible historical crew insignia. There was a brief pause on the line before the duty officer responded with mild confusion. Cruz understood why. Requests like this did not normally come from the pier during visitor hours. He glanced again toward the gangway where Lieutenant Parker remained firmly planted in front of the ladder while the old veteran stood a few feet away, calm and patient as ever. Cruz lowered his voice even further. The patch shows an anchor with a 5-star ring, he continued. Old design, likely Cold War era. I believe it may be associated with the original crew of this vessel before the refit. On the other end of the line, the duty officer asked a short question that Cruz had already expected. Do you have a name? Cruz hesitated for half a second, then answered. Not yet confirmed. Elderly male, approximately 80 years old, wearing the patch on a Navy jacket. He mentioned he served aboard the ship under its previous configuration. The line went quiet for several seconds while the operations office began checking records. Cruz felt his pulse tick steadily in his throat as he waited. Around him, the activity on the pier continued as if nothing unusual was happening. A young family walked past holding a small American flag that fluttered brightly in the breeze. 2 sailors laughed quietly while pushing a supply cart toward the far end of the dock. Overhead, the gulls continued circling lazily above the harbor water. But Cruz's attention remained locked on the 2 figures near the gangway. Lieutenant Parker had shifted his stance slightly, clearly growing more impatient with the situation. Sir, I am going to ask you one more time to step away from the boarding ladder, Parker said firmly. The ship is not open to unscheduled visitors. The veteran nodded once again, completely unbothered by the tone. His eyes drifted across the hull of the destroyer, as if he were listening to the quiet mechanical rhythm inside it. After a moment, he spoke softly. You keep her in good shape, he said. Parker blinked at the unexpected comment. Excuse me. The old man tilted his head toward the waterline where the sunlight shimmered. Along the ship's steel plating. Hull maintenance, he continued calmly. Not a lot of corrosion. That means your crew takes pride in the work. One of the nearby sailors chuckled again, whispering something to his friend. Parker did not smile. Instead, he crossed his arms, his expression tightening slightly as he tried to maintain authority in front of the growing crowd. Sir, this conversation is over, he said. At that moment, Cruz's communicator crackled softly in his hand. The voice on the other end sounded different now, more alert than before. Petty Officer Cruz, the duty officer said carefully. Confirm the name of the individual wearing that patch. Cruz looked toward the veteran again and raised his voice slightly across the pier. Sir, he called politely, may I ask your name? The old man turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes settling on Cruz with quiet curiosity. For a brief second, the wind lifted the sleeve of his jacket again, revealing the faded patch clearly in the sunlight. Then he answered in the same calm tone he had used all morning. Callahan, he said. Robert Callahan. Cruz felt the air leave his lungs as if the harbor itself had gone silent. He brought the communicator back to his mouth and spoke just 2 words into it. Name confirmed. On the other end of the line, the duty officer did not respond immediately. Instead, Cruz heard the faint scrape of a chair moving quickly across the operations office floor. Somewhere inside the destroyer's command structure, the name Robert Callahan had just reached a pair of ears that had not forgotten it. Inside the destroyer's operations center, the atmosphere changed in an instant. The room had been quiet only seconds earlier, filled with the steady glow of navigation screens and the low murmur of routine reports. Then the duty officer turned from the communications console and repeated the name he had just heard through the headset. Robert Callahan. The words seemed to settle heavily in the air. A few sailors nearby glanced up from their stations with mild curiosity, unsure why the officer had suddenly gone still. But at the far end of the room another man had heard it clearly. Admiral Richard Halvorsen had been standing near the main chart display reviewing the ship's schedule for the upcoming fleet demonstration. His uniform was immaculate, the gold stripes on his sleeve catching the bright overhead lights as he studied the map. At first the name reached him like a distant echo, something familiar but unexpected. Then the recognition struck all at once. The Admiral's head lifted slowly, and he turned toward the duty officer. "Repeat that name," he said. The room grew quiet immediately. The duty officer straightened slightly. "Sir, Petty Officer Cruz on Pier 14 reports an elderly visitor wearing a historical crew patch," he replied carefully. The individual identified himself as Robert Callahan. For a brief moment Admiral Halvorsen did not move. The officers around him watched the subtle shift in his expression as the memory returned with unmistakable clarity. Decades of service had taught the Admiral to keep his composure under any circumstance. Yet something deeper passed through his eyes now, something that belonged to another time entirely. He stepped closer to the console. "Describe the patch," he said quietly. The duty officer glanced down at the note on the screen. "Circular insignia, sir. Anchor at the center, surrounded by 5 stars. Faded fabric. Appears unofficial." The Admiral exhaled slowly, almost like a man who had just opened a door to the past. Around him the younger officers exchanged uncertain glances. None of them understood why such a simple description had suddenly captured the full attention of a fleet admiral. Halvorsen looked down at the deck map for a moment, his eyes resting on the gray outline of the destroyer moored outside the window. When he finally spoke again his voice was calm, but unmistakably firm. "That patch was never issued officially," he said. "It was sewn by hand after a night, when that ship nearly did not return to port." The officers around him listened in silence. The Admiral straightened and reached for his cap resting on the nearby table. "If that man is who I believe he is," he continued, "then the crew standing on that pier owes him more than a tour." He placed the cap on his head with precise movement and turned toward the exit of the operations center. The duty officer hesitated before asking the obvious question. "Sir, should we send security to escort the visitor aboard?" Admiral Halvorsen paused at the doorway and shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. "I will go myself." Outside on Pier 14 the wind continued sweeping across the harbor, rattling loose lines against metal rails while the visitors watched the quiet standoff near the gangway. Lieutenant Parker still stood firm in front of the ladder, determined to follow every regulation exactly as he had been trained. Robert Callahan remained a few steps away from the boarding point, his gaze drifting calmly across the destroyer's deck, as if he were waiting for the ship itself to say something. None of them noticed the sudden movement on the upper deck as a group of sailors stepped aside to clear a path along the rail. And none of them yet realized that one of the most senior officers in the entire fleet had just begun walking down the pier toward them. The wind sweeping across Pier 14 carried the distant sound of footsteps long before anyone noticed who was approaching. Sailors on the upper deck of the destroyer were the first to react. One by one they straightened their posture and quietly stepped aside along the rail as a tall figure in a dark navy uniform appeared near the base of the ship's superstructure. The sunlight flashed across the gold trim on his cap as he began walking down the pier with steady, purposeful strides. At first the visitors gathered near the rope line simply assumed another officer had arrived to handle the situation at the gangway. But the sailors recognized the insignia immediately. Conversation stopped. A few of them instinctively moved to attention. On the pier below, Lieutenant Ethan Parker was still focused on the elderly man standing a few feet away from the ladder. Parker had just begun to repeat the same firm instruction he had given several times already. "Sir, I am going to have to insist that you move away from the boarding point," he said. "I cannot allow you to remain here." Robert Callahan listened calmly as the wind tugged lightly at the sleeve of his old jacket. The faded patch shifted again in the sunlight, but he did not seem to notice. His eyes had drifted back toward the deck of the destroyer where a group of sailors were now watching the pier with unusual attention. Parker followed their gaze briefly but did not immediately understand what had changed. Then he heard the sound behind him, the rhythm of measured footsteps moving across the concrete. Parker turned instinctively and felt his posture snap upright the moment he recognized the approaching figure. Admiral Richard Halvorsen was walking directly toward the gangway. The crowd of visitors fell silent as the Admiral passed through them. His presence carried the kind of quiet authority that did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures. Even the wind seemed to soften as he approached. Parker immediately stepped to attention. "Admiral on deck." One of the sailors on the pier called out sharply. Several nearby sailors straightened instantly, their boots aligning with a crisp precision that rippled across the pier like a wave. Parker saluted without hesitation. "Good morning, Admiral," he said firmly. Halvorsen returned the salute with a short nod, but did not slow his stride. His eyes had already moved past the lieutenant and settled on the quiet old man standing near the gangway. For a few seconds the Admiral said nothing. He simply studied the figure in front of him. Robert Callahan stood exactly as he had before, hands relaxed at his sides, his expression calm as the harbor wind stirred the silver hair above his collar. The two men looked at each other across only a few feet of concrete. Parker remained frozen beside the latter, suddenly uncertain whether he had made a mistake somewhere in the past few minutes. Around them, the visitors watched in complete silence. Even the gulls circling above seemed to drift farther away from the pier as the moment stretched longer. The Admiral's gaze dropped slowly from Callahan's face to the worn sleeve of his jacket. The faded patch rested there quietly against the fabric, its old stitching barely visible after decades of wear. Halvorsen took one small step closer. For a brief moment his expression softened with something that looked almost like disbelief. Then recognition settled firmly into his eyes. The Admiral drew a slow breath, straightened his shoulders, and without another word raised his hand in a formal salute directed not at the lieutenant beside him, but at the elderly sailor standing calmly in front of the gangway. For a moment the entire pier seemed to freeze in place. Admiral Richard Halvorsen's salute remained steady, his hand raised with the precise discipline of a man who had spent a lifetime in uniform. The bright morning sun caught the gold braid on his sleeve as the wind stirred lightly across the harbor, but he did not move. Around him, the sailors on deck and along the pier watched, in stunned silence. Lieutenant Ethan Parker felt the world tilt slightly beneath his boots. The salute was unmistakable. It was formal, deliberate, and directed at the elderly man standing quietly a few feet away from the gangway. Parker's mind raced as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Admirals did not salute civilians. Admirals did not interrupt their schedules to walk down a pier for an unidentified visitor. Yet here it was happening directly in front of him. Robert Callahan blinked once as if surprised by the sudden attention. The wind lifted the edge of his old jacket again, and the faded patch shifted softly against the worn fabric. For a brief moment the veteran looked almost uncomfortable with the spotlight that had fallen on him. Then he straightened slowly and returned the salute with calm precision. The movement was smooth despite the years that had bent his shoulders. Anyone watching closely could see that the gesture was practiced, the kind of salute that had been repeated thousands of times during a lifetime of service. Admiral Halvorsen lowered his hand but did not step back. Instead, he looked directly at the older man with a quiet respect that left no doubt about what he had recognized. "Chief Callahan," the Admiral said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent pier. The title alone sent a ripple of confusion through the nearby sailors and visitors. Lieutenant Parker felt his chest tighten. He had spent the past 10 minutes speaking to the man like an ordinary tourist, while an admiral was now addressing him with the honor reserved for one of the most respected positions in naval service. Halvorsen took another small step forward and glanced briefly at the destroyer beside them. The massive ship towered above the pier, its steel hull reflecting the sunlight like a silent witness to the moment unfolding below. "I wondered if you would ever come back to see her," the Admiral continued quietly. Callahan's eyes drifted toward the ship again. His gaze moved slowly across the deck, lingering for a second on the radar tower and the bridge windows. "She looks taller now," he said softly. The Admiral allowed himself a faint smile. "We added a few things over the years," he replied. A few sailors on the deck exchanged uncertain glances as the meaning of the exchange slowly began to settle into place. The quiet, old man standing on the pier was clearly more than a visitor. Parker remained rigid beside the gangway ladder, his mind replaying every word he had spoken earlier. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him as the Admiral turned slightly toward him. Halvorson's voice remained calm, but carried a tone of quiet authority that filled the space between them. "Lieutenant," he said, "do you know who this man is?" Parker opened his mouth, but no words came. The Admiral turned back to the veteran before the silence could grow uncomfortable. "This ship is still sailing today because of him," Halvorson said simply. A soft murmur spread through the small crowd of visitors behind the rope line. Sailors on the deck leaned forward slightly, suddenly eager to hear more. The Admiral gestured toward the gangway with a respectful motion of his hand. "Chief Callahan," he said, "the ship is waiting for you." For several seconds no one moved. The harbor wind swept across the pier and fluttered the small American flags held by the visitors standing behind the rope line. But the moment itself felt perfectly still. Lieutenant Ethan Parker stood frozen beside the gangway ladder, his mind struggling to process everything that had just unfolded in front of him. The Admiral had not raised his voice. He had not delivered a speech or demanded attention. Yet with only a few calm words he had changed the entire atmosphere on the pier. Robert Callahan looked at the gangway slowly, as if measuring the distance between the present and a lifetime that now stretched decades behind him. The steel ladder rose only 12 feet to the deck of the destroyer, but the quiet pause in his eyes suggested he was seeing far more than the physical steps. He was seeing the ship as it had been long ago, younger and unfinished, before the years of upgrades and new technology had changed its silhouette against the horizon. Admiral Halvorson waited patiently beside him, his posture relaxed but respectful, giving the old sailor all the time he needed. Finally, Callahan nodded once and placed his hand lightly on the metal rail beside the ladder. The cool steel felt familiar beneath his fingers. Without another word, he began to climb. Each step was steady, deliberate, the movement of someone who had walked the decks of ships long before many of the sailors now watching had even been born. As he reached the top of the gangway, the sailors standing along the rail instinctively straightened. One of them quietly called out the command that echoed down the deck. "Attention on deck." Boots aligned in crisp unison as the crew stood tall, the line of uniforms forming a silent corridor along the destroyer's edge. Callahan stepped onto the deck and paused for a moment, looking out across the harbor where the water reflected the bright morning sky. The wind carried the scent of salt and distant engines across the ship, just as it had countless times before. Admiral Halvorson followed a few steps behind and stopped near the top of the gangway, allowing the veteran to take in the moment without interruption. Down on the pier, Lieutenant Parker remained where he stood, still trying to reconcile the quiet elderly man he had stopped earlier with the respect now surrounding him. The Admiral turned his head slightly toward the lieutenant and spoke just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Lieutenant," he said calmly, "every sailor learns that ships are built from steel and machinery. But the truth is that ships survive because of people." Parker swallowed and nodded once, understanding the lesson without another word. On the deck above, Callahan walked slowly toward the forward rail and rested his hands against the metal, gazing out over the Atlantic horizon. A few younger sailors watched him with curiosity, while others simply stood in respectful silence. Admiral Halvorson joined him at the rail after a moment. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, the Admiral glanced toward the faded patch on the old jacket sleeve and said quietly, "Some names fade from the records, Chief, but the sea remembers." Callahan allowed himself the faintest smile as the wind moved gently across the deck. "That is enough for me," he replied softly. And as the destroyer's crew stood silently around him, the old sailor looked out across the water with the calm understanding that respect is never demanded, it is earned, and once earned it is never truly forgotten.